Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
Bob Anthony.
And I'm their guest and friend, Alan Singer.
Thanks again for joining us, Dr. Alan Singer, educator, historian. We're putting this session together the Wednesday before what normally would be a Monday air date, but we'll probably upload it to YouTube on the weekend sometime. And then put out the word on when it might show up on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. So in any event,
It's July 5th.
yeah, you can find us on YouTube and LinkedIn and eventually Manhattan Neighborhood Network. But lots of stuff going on. This is the post day after Independence Day for the US of A. And interesting special they had for the Macy's fireworks last night, just as a quick aside before we start. And they started out with a bunch of music before, but when the actual fireworks program came on, they ran an entire Motown medley. and I'm listening to this Motown medley and I'm watching all the performers. I'm saying to myself, Frederick Douglass might have a little problem with this, because when he wrote his essay, "What to the Slave is Your 4th of July," to come back, what, a couple of hundred years later and see all these descendants of slaves and all their music being the mainstay for the Independence Day parade, I think he might have been scratching his head. but that was my take. But anyway, let's, as journalists, historians, and people who take stock of the rights of the individuals that the Constitution is supposed to protect, one of which is freedom of the press. Our lead story has to deal with the fact that the New York Police Department decided that they just didn't like a particular journalist and decided they were going to throw her in jail. Bob, tell us about that story. This is just the most horrendous thing I've seen to come down the pike in a while.
Yeah, this was this was a journalist who was covering one of the protests over the subway death of Jordan Neely, the homeless man who was choked to death in the subway by ex-Marine who allegedly was protecting the public and was allowed to walk away the day of the incident. So that's still in the courts. But there was a photographer covering one of the protests, and apparently one of the NYPD higher ups decided that he didn't want her there. And on a video shot by someone nearby, you can hear him saying, "Lock her up." So the police basically wade into the crowd, ignore other people, and arrest other journalists, yes, and arrest her, because I don't know the two of them, think she's, he didn't like seeing her at events. So he decided to have her arrested. Now, since then,
very prominent. She's a very prominent photographer.
She is. I just was at her Instagram site. She was nominated for, she was part of a group that was nominated for Pulitzer. I mean, she's a well-known journalist. And she was wearing all of her credentials that day.
She's wearing her press pass. She's doing her job as any true professional photojournalist can and will do, especially at the height of a major protest on a high-profile story. She's just out doing her job. Alan,
I think that's why they targeted her, because she had posts her photos. They've been done by Getty, New York Times, Bloomberg, Reuters, The Guardian. So she's very prominent, and she's been very active in the protest, the political photography.
She covers them.
Shots January 6th, but she was very active in the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. So she has documented police misbehavior and right-wing misbehavior. And it can't just be a coincidence that they targeted her.
Correct. And just to be clear, her name is Stephanie Keith, is her name. And yeah, she's very well known among the photojournalist community. in the entire region. And during the protests, a lot of people were arrested on misdemeanor counts. All of those charges have been dropped, but her summons has been retained. And even though that's a lower level than the misdemeanor charge, and the DA's office argues that we don't deal with summonses. It would be, a bad precedent, or it would be, what was the word they used?
Yeah, we can't single her case out because we no longer deal with those summons. So it'd be preferential treatment or some crazy.
Exactly. It was, yes, it would be unequal, but I don't see what's a problem about actually defending a First Amendment right to cover an event.
Like saying, sorry, we did this.
Yeah, he could
Yes.
toss that out. Alvin Bragg could toss that in a minute.
Yes.
And just say, okay, well, we got rid of all those misdemeanors. This is less than a misdemeanor. Get rid of that.
It would be a minor thing, but no. So it's being maintained, and she has to go through the process. The summons, I bet you, will be dismissed, but why he can't just do it out of hand? I don't get that. And she was the video is pretty egregious. It's not just one cop arresting her; it's a group of cops swarming her after the local, after the police official says lock her up.
The chief of patrols, yes.
Yeah, the chief of patrol. So this is rather egregious. I fully expect the journalism organizations that I'm connected with, including the Society of Professional Journalists and NABJ and the Press Club and the Silurians. I'm sure this will end up in a joint statement at some point to complain about this.
Yes, there needs to be an official complaint by major news medias and small news media about this kind of treatment of a true professional doing her job and getting arrested for doing her job. Not what's supposed to be happening in a, quote, democratic state, home of the free. What's those other quotes? Never mind.
Land of the free, home of the brave, and the
yes. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right. That purports to protect the rights of the individual, and especially of a free press. One of the actual rights that are listed in the original, what was that? The first 10 amendments, Bill of Rights.
Number one.
Okay.
Yes. So it's not hard for the DA's office to find the legal precedent or the foundation for which to dismiss this thing. So I don't get this.
What we have is the system, an arm of the judicial system, flexing its muscle because of something they don't agree with or a person they do not like. And federal example of that is the recent ruling by, the headline that caught my eye was Trump appointed judge stymies Biden administration from contacting social media. And I'm going, how can a judge stop an administration from contacting social media? What kind of ruling could that be? I read the story and it comes out that 2 Republican attorney generals in 2 red states filed some kind of brief accusing the Biden administration of censorship and I don't know, coercion, a bunch of crazy charges. And this judge says, yeah, you're right, injunction, you can't talk to the social media. But Biden administration, from what I read in the article, is basically contacting social media to say you need to take down all the misinformation you have about vaccines that are being perpetrated by these crazies, all this other misinformation that's causing our general population to endanger their health because of all this misinformation. And the thrust of the contact was the safety of the general public. Basically, the administration doing its job to protect the American people. And here comes this bogus suit that's being filed. Alan, you have a quote from that thing about the judge that could explain how stupid this ruling is?
this is what concerns me. Social media companies are private corporations. They're not government. I have a right to say, I have a right to believe what I want. I have a right to speak. But they don't have an obligation to print it, to post it. New York Times has, I frequently write letters to the Times, or I post on their columns. They don't always publish them. It's their venue. I could submit, but they don't have to accept. And I think what the federal government is saying to social media is you have a responsibility to monitor when things are hate-filled or they're just out and out lies. And what this right-wing judge said, well, if you don't permit right-wing loonies to post, or if you they have to take it down because there's no evidence supporting it, because it's just a God, what do they call them? Conspiracy theory. Well, you have to post it. And you know, when I'm looking at this is the freedom to lie is not guaranteed in the United States Constitution. And what we have, there's a really right-wing Trump justices who are trying to make bigotry into law. I mean, Eric, you had talked about this other one in Oklahoma. I mean, bigotry is unfortunately very pronounced in the United States, whatever the Supreme Court may say.
And I'd just like to point out that this judge, Judge Terry A. Doty of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Louisiana, he released this on the 4th of July, this ruling, which is just an attempt to make news. I mean, well, it's a federal holiday, for God's sakes, if he didn't know that. This is basically you can't say fire in a crowded theater. You're not allowed to say that. Free speech has its boundaries, and dangerous speech is not protected speech. I mean, I don't get this ruling at all. He's telling the Biden administration he can't go to TikTok, he can't go to Twitter, he can't go to Instagram or Facebook and say that post about 5G towers generating COVID has to stay. Of course, the administration should tell them to take those down. But in this ruling, he says, no, you can't. You can't touch them, which is just indecipherable.
Part of the ruling hinged on the fact that they were supposedly interfering with the rights of free speech, their First Amendment right, etc. And the right of the federal government to protect the general welfare is part of the Constitution. The fact that someone in the administration you didn't say you have to do this or else, they just said, we would like very much for you to take this down. But they're claiming it's coercion, they're claiming it's co-opting their free speech rights, whatever they're claiming. But basically, you're also co-opting the individuals in the administration from exercising their free speech right by contacting those social media companies to say, in our opinion, this is not helpful to the general public. You need to take that down. Why should he stop their free speech communication rights? Doesn't make sense to me. There's a disconnect with your protecting somebody's free speech right to put lies and misinformation to harm people, and stopping somebody else's free speech right to warn people that this is misinformation. You see where I'm coming from? There's something crazy about this.
A quick question, Alan. Does this feel like a setup so that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Jim Jordan can basically, say what they want and on social media and get away with it?
I think you're right, Bob. What's interesting also is at the same time you have the right-wing loonies are saying we have the freedom of speech to say what we want, whatever, without any evidence. At least in Florida, what DeSantis has tried to do, in other states that have censored on what they call critical race theory, they claim they support freedom of speech, but they are putting blocks on teachers, on public employees, are not allowed to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're not allowed to discuss slavery in the United States. Somehow they argue they have the unlimited right to freedom of speech, but other people don't. And that's also very scary.
Yeah, right. So within the purview of judges and the judiciary and people in the criminal justice system doing and saying crazy things and then coming down with questionable rulings, that takes me to the Oklahoma story that we covered on Media Watch about a month and a half ago, where these Oklahoma officials were in a public meeting that they decided they were going to close to the public, and so they ushered everybody out, and this journalist left his microphone behind, actually wittingly, because he knew it was a public meeting and that they should not have been closing it, because they were going to continue to hold a meeting, which they did. And in the course of their closed door discussion, sheriff and other elected officials were talking about murdering the journalist who had been covering the meeting, actually murdering this man. And then possibly, maybe we should go out and maybe lynch some Black people while we're at it. Back in the good old days, we could do stuff like that. So maybe we should bring that back. This is part of their discussion. And so it gets reported out to the general public, and everybody seems irate and incensed. And then after the investigation, the chief prosecutor in the state of Oklahoma says, no, we can't charge the sheriff with anything because he actually didn't do anything. And so the fact that he considered maybe murdering a journalist, there's nothing we can do about it. So, I mean, I'm saying, yeah, you can't force somebody to fire somebody. Says, oh no, that's up to the people who elected him. He was elected, they have to vote him out of office. So this criminal justice system, to me, in this country, is just so skewed in down the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole. If you deal with a judge that says the federal government can't protect the health and welfare of the country because they're interfering with somebody's, quote, free speech rights, and a state prosecutor, I can't charge these people with possibly contemplating, thinking about killing somebody. Maybe when two people get together and talk about something, that's sort of a conspiracy. Well, maybe not. Maybe I'm stretching it. But you know where I'm coming from.
But these people are there to protect the public trust, and apparently they did not have the public trust in mind when they said that. But I'm sorry, Alan, I cut you off.
Oh no, the quote was, he said we should hire mafia hitmen. That's malfeasance. How can you have a sheriff who has that position, who wants to hire mafia hitmen to kill journalists? And
I don't see why some charge can't be brought against somebody with that kind of statement in a discussion. It just
removal from office as for malfeasance. The other thing is, and one of the people on the tape said, you know, we can't lynch Blacks anymore. They got more rights than we got. Again, that's part of the right-wing argument against things like affirmative action, is that somehow minorities have all the rights and all the protections. This is scary kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that the Proud Boys say. That's the kind of stuff that neo-Nazis say. That's what they were chanting in Charlottesville. So this is not just light commentary. This is really scary stuff. That a sheriff is espousing or participating in this discussion.
And other elected officials. It wasn't just the sheriff. These are other elected officials in that town in Oklahoma, cavalierly discussing lynching and murder.
And technically, they said it during a live public meeting, which means that all records of that public meeting, by law, have to be recorded, and can be used for evidence.
That's why that reporter left the microphone, because he knew it was a public meeting. And he knew they were trying to run something by the public by ushering folk out, even though it was called as a public meeting.
Now, I'm a journalist, and I've been in that situation where a board or a council tried to call a closed session in the middle of a public meeting. You have to give notice if you're going to go into closed session, and it has to be like days' notice. You can't just do it that moment.
You can't
So
turn a public meeting into a private meeting.
Right.
It-
In New
yeah.
York, it's called the
Now-
open meeting law. New York
Yes.
has an open meeting law. You cannot do that. And
yes,
That's it. And the reporter knew the law.
yes,
And because he knew the law and had used it more than once, that's why they were discussing murdering him. Because he had captured them in other meetings and they didn't like the fact that his journalistic integrity was so high that, so they said, well, you know, we should think about getting rid of him. Well, hire a mafia hitman, whatever. But that's how egregious that crap was and is, because they're not getting prosecuted for anything. So, but hey, speaking of law enforcement and things that are egregious, we're going to flip to the other side of the pond because,
big pond.
yeah, the big pond, because even though things starting to quiet down now, the fact that I think the kid was 17 years old that this police officer in Paris or Paris suburb shot.
He murdered. The police officer murdered him.
Yeah, I'm being generous when I say shot. And they actually have him up on charges right now. But the point of the matter is, the folks in that particular part of Paris were sick and tired of that kind of treatment from the cops. So they started to riot and then just became a national outpouring of discontent over similar police treatment of Black and brown people, Muslims, Blacks, Arabs, you name it. They said, you know, they do this all the time to us. We're sick and tired of this. So Paris has been burning. Much of France has been burning. The latest update, guys?
Bob, you want to start or should I?
I believe. Go ahead, Alan. The president Emmanuel Macron said that things had been quieting down and that the worst of the protests are over. Whether that's true or not, but that's the message he's trying to send. But go ahead, Alan.
All right. But the key is, well, the protest may be over this time. The circumstances that led to the protest are not. And what we have is both in the United States and in France, some very similar racial tensions that have been building. In France, it's interesting. In the United States, the ghettos were inner city. In France, the ghettos are in the rings outside the city. They wanted to protect their inner city. But what you have are large numbers of people of African and Middle Eastern descent, many are Muslims, who live in these outer ring housing with no access to jobs. I mean, you look, I think the estimate's like a 30% unemployment. So these are situations that are waiting to explode. People constantly being harassed by police. But the other thing is people feel there's no respect for who they are. One of the other symbolic events was a woman soccer player who was Islamic wore the hijab while she was playing, and it was banned. So she would no longer able to play for her team.
It came down with a national ban.
A national ban.
Just a local, you can't wear it here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And people just saw that as just another incidence of total disrespect for who they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
I mean, the initial narrative of the shooting was that the 17-year-old tried to run over the police. And here again, we had a third-party video showing that they shot from the side as the youth attempted to drive off. But,
right.
Yeah.
The car was not moving when the kid was shot. And
Correct.
The policeman was just aiming at him. It was a very frightening video.
So similar stories in France and here, the usual, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know where we are on time, but
well, we have about 3 minutes, just to be clear.
The segue really, and we need more in-depth time to deal with that. But if you take a look at how France handled those suburbs, that's like how Israel handles the Palestinians in their midst. And so that Israeli raid, really a serious inroads, first major kind of militaristic inroads. I think 6 or 7 Palestinians were killed in this recent raid by the Israelis. And basically this is that battle between these settlers who want to take more Palestinian lands after they went rampaging through the area. And then these folks said, no, we're tired of this. And so this back and forth continues.
You know, there was an interesting piece. I think it was, I got the reference from Jamal Bowie in the New York Times, but W.E.B. Du Bois, an leading African-American philosopher, historian at the beginning of the 20th century. Du Bois' most famous work is called The Soul of Black Folk. But he actually writes an article which is then republished in 1920 called The Soul of White Folk. And what Du Bois says, and after the horrors of World War I, which were perpetrated by whites killing whites, what Du Bois says is that the world is really plagued by the sense among white European people of European ancestry that their civilization, their religion, their way of looking at things is better than everybody else's. And he says how they could maintain that after the slaughter of World War I is unbelievable. But he says, you know, it's like they don't understand that other people cry, that other people love their children. And he writes that in 1920. But that's what I think we're looking at in with the continuing racism in the United States, the issue in Oklahoma, that business of lying on social media, the reporter who gets arrested, in France and the Jenin camp. It's like there's no sense that other people have humanity.
Yeah. We're talking about white supremacy writ large is basically what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, it is a global plague. It's not just in the United States of America. That is true.
Right. And we have about 25 seconds.
And that being the cap for it, let's just call it a day on this quote, day after the celebration for land of the free, home of the brave. All men are created equal. And for some reason, we can't quite seem to make that happen in the 21st century, whether it's on these shores or across the globe. And with that, this has been Media Watch, folks. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony. Catch up to us on YouTube at Media Watch EVT.
And I'm their friend and guest, Alan Singer. Thank you for having me again.
Thanks for joining us, Dr. Singer. And folks, we'll catch you the next time. Stay safe.